Move more together for you, your team, and a good cause. Join the Movivo Move Days, the ultimate health challenge during Lent, and win exclusive prizes. Collect points for 45 days in the Movivo app, together with your colleagues or in your own personal way. Whether it's through your favorite sports, breathing exercises, giving up sugar, or ice bathing, every point counts. Are you ready?
Welcome to the Wonder Pill Movement, the podcast designed for everyone who wants to take their health into their own hands. Today, another special episode right in the middle of the Move Days, the health challenge for companies and a good cause. And so, once again, we have a truly exceptional guest with us today, a Move Days expert who has been a part of our event for many, many years. He is a genuine pioneer in the field of corporate health promotion and also a leading figure in Austrian performance diagnostics. A very warm welcome to Hans Holdhaus from Holdhaus Nord. It's truly wonderful that you're once again enriching the Move Days with your invaluable expertise.
Absolutely. I'm pleased to be joining you once more when that we're covering such an interesting subject where hopefully we can make many interested people a little bit happier with some good information and the latest news.
Yes, you always tell me there are two crucial health parameters that everyone should be aware of, which truly reveal a great deal. One is heart rate variability. We've already done an episode on that. If you want to know more about it, feel free to scroll down a bit. There's already an episode with Hans. Today, the second parameter that's in focus for our health, which is increasingly moving from competitive sports into the health sector, VO₂max, maximum oxygen uptake. What is it? In a nutshell, we'll dive right in.
Well, if you will, as a practical everyday phrase, because I believe that's the decisive thing. What does that mean? Well, I'd put it this way. It's essentially your body's maximum ability to convert oxygen into energy, or to put it differently, even more simply, how much power per minute you have available when it truly counts. That's how I pretty much describe it.
Yes, that's practical for daily use. But why is that so important? Why is that important in sports? And why is it important in healthcare?
Yes, you just mentioned it earlier, actually. We've already talked about heart rate variability before, and I believe when we're discussing modern health today, there are two distinct levels to consider. There's a kind of daily form, and then there's, if you will, a sort of basic underlying capacity. HRV is excellent for assessing your daily condition. This means how well is my nervous system regulated? How well, for example, do I compensate for stress? And VO₂max is essentially the other side. This means how powerful is my cardiovascular engine, or how much power can my system generally generate. That's essentially, so to speak, the difference. Why is this so important? Yes, because we actually know a lot more now. VO₂max is relatively closely correlated with the risk for certain health issues, such as cardiovascular diseases, metabolic problems, and even mortality. There are strong correlations, and there are already some fascinating studies on this, which can clearly prove that even one EMET, a metabolic unit, leads to greater fitness. And that corresponds to approximately, I just looked it up again, I don't always know all the data, it corresponds to approximately 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And on average, this is associated with about 13% less overall mortality and even 15% less of this cardiovascular risk. So a magnitude that might surprise many people right away in the first step, because it's not just about sports, but it's also about this. And that is in reality a really big health lever from my perspective.
And then an improvement like that, 3.5 milliliters, 1 met, that's not something that's too far-fetched to achieve. You can definitely accomplish that with just a little bit of training, and then you've truly done something quite remarkable for your health. Let's take a quick look back at the world of sports. There are always statistics, especially from endurance athletes, that are simply unbelievable. What kind of numbers are we talking about? How much does an endurance-trained person, a competitive athlete, have? What values are there to consider?
So in the peak ranges, people are typically achieving values of around 80 to 90 milliliters per kilogram per minute, sometimes even exceeding that significantly. And I actually just received some very recent up-to-the-minute information on this topic. Up until now, the highest value ever recorded for V2 max, the maximum oxygen uptake, was held by Oscar Svensson. This is a cyclist who had 97.5 milliliters up to now. And now it gets exciting. Yeah, this value has been topped, and that just recently. Few people know this yet, namely by Christian Blumenfeld. There's also a cyclist, and now, hold on tight, his value has already been made visible. He has an incredible value of 101.1 milliliters. Wow.
So we have absolutely shattered the 100 mark.
The $100 bill is all gone.
Incredible. So it's hard to imagine when you consider that, on the other hand, the lowest values, and we're not talking about sports here, but simply about the average car user, are somehow below 20, the 20s. So that's an unbelievable difference. And yes, that probably won't be topped anytime soon.
This naturally shows the range in which we can operate and the range in which humans can adapt both positively and negatively. One more question about cycling. Now, there's a cyclist who for years has dominated everything, who wins all the major tours, Tadej Pogacar. Why isn't Blumenfeld winning every single race if he's the one who has measured the highest value up to now? Where is Pogacar, and why isn't that everything in sports?
Well, the thing is, of course, that there are very personal and also individual differences. You know, every person is just different, and everyone naturally brings along some other prerequisites. And we mustn't forget that this, of course, in the top league, even in the smallest details, still makes a significant difference, doesn't it? That maybe one person here is able to achieve a little bit more than the other, right? Because ultimately, it's always about how these specific values actually come into being, right? And one simply has to state this very, very clearly. That only happens when the heart, if you will, has a truly enormous stroke volume. That means the heart can pump a lot of blood with each beat, right? That's one part of the story, fast pause. The second thing to consider is how much oxygen can the system actually transport? Yeah, pause. I mean, regarding the blood and hematocrit capacity, that's what it's called, you know. And then it's also about our cells, specifically the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cell. So how effectively can I use them, you know? That is the third. And the fourth, obviously, is how much training volume I have built up here over many years. And these are, in reality, exactly the parameters that count at the end of the day, why such top athletes can generate these values, right? And in comparison now, since you've already brought up cyclists, also naturally, for instance, compared to other sports like football and such, there it's not so much about having these peak values, but rather it's more about how because they do, for example, in football, yes, they have completely different demands than a cyclist, right? That means they have their, what do they have? Mainly repetitive sprints, right? They need quick recovery between sprints to perform again, right? So it's about how well they can actually perform even in these short phases. That's the actual difference, right? So this is also quite exciting. It's not just the absolute maximum value that counts, but also how can they simply call that up, you know?
We definitely to add some context, where does a Bundesliga player stand? Perhaps, let's say, using the German Bundesliga as a benchmark, what kind of figures do they have?
Yes, they're already in between. I would also say there's a range there, yeah. But you will certainly find some, like 60 to 70, you will find some, yes, definitely, perhaps even a little bit more.
For context, let's say an ambitious hobby athlete who perhaps runs a half marathon, training 2 to 3 hours a week. Of course, that's also a range, very individual. But where can one approximately find themselves there?
Yes, so fundamentally, the classification itself can actually be found through a certain groupings.
This means the value alone is only relevant if you know the age and gender. There are now ways to assign it to categories. But I would say if it's somewhat close, it really also depends on age, obviously. So that naturally has an influence around 40. Yeah, that would be desirable. Yes. So if you're between 35 and 45, for example, you can definitely find yourself somewhere in that range. Then you're certainly at a much better level, yes.
Definitely.
Yes, that already gives us the framework. So this episode isn't just interesting for athletes, but truly for everyone interested in their health. And now we'll dive deep into the topic. Yes, you've already mentioned that there are studies indicating how an improvement in VO2max can indeed contribute to a longer lifespan, right? That mortality rates decrease and the risk for certain cardiovascular diseases also significantly declines. How exactly did researchers come to this conclusion, and what is the very latest research telling us about this connection?
Basically, it is the case that one has indeed recognized, yes, that the value now is not just interesting for high performance athletes in terms of what they can implement here, but that precisely due to the data and the ongoing research in this specific field suggests that this VO2max market value isn't truly a standalone value in and of itself, but rather it's something that you could easily call a biomarker
for a specific system quality.
So that means the cardiovascular metabolic system, muscles, and the autonomic nervous system. Everything is affected by it, right? And the extensive data that's available now is very consistent, right? This means we can now say quite clearly, the fitter you are, the better the prognosis, right? What this means is a really, really good example of this in a rather extensive study of, I believe, more than 120,000 individuals. Yes, the mortality rate there was progressively lower with rising levels of physical fitness.
Okay, it should also be mentioned that the elite group compared to the low fitness group had an 80% lower risk.
Yes, so that is quite immense, isn't it? It also sounds dramatic. And yes, it is actually something that has now definitely been widely or repeatedly confirmed to be true. Yes. And what
is that? By now, it's already become quite please.
I also wanted to add what's quite clear, actually, because that would practically be the next question in that direction. Where is this all heading, and where do you, so to speak, have the greatest leverage here? And I can tell you that unequivocally, because I have now also conducted many measurements. We might come back to that later, but it's very clear that the leap from very low to medium in terms of health and quality of life, and thus risk minimization, is actually the best. This can be unequivocally stated because if you manage to escape from this very lowest range, you truly gain a disproportionately large amount. And that, in my opinion, is also fundamentally the reason why the VO2max value has now, over time, been able to achieve such a significant standing in health programs, and indeed already possesses it. And it's not just about high performance data, but it's also truly about prevention, getting out of the risk zone. So that's a really interesting approach, I think. It's absolutely fantastic. Definitely, definitely.
So cardiovascular diseases are actually is the leading cause of death in the Western world. Naturally, everyone will eventually die of something. There's no doubt about that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be an early death, and it certainly doesn't have to be a premature heart attack. And if we can simply, through movement and consistent training, get those who are not yet active out of this critical risk zone. And for you personally, that is, of course, also a tremendous gain in quality of life. How do you experience that in everyday life? For example, if you now have 3.5 milliliters more available.
How does that manifest?
The truth is, if you were to ask me, it's almost like a sudden aha moment for many people. That means, for example, climbing flights of stairs without feeling as if my pulse is practically bursting right out of my neck, something like that. I can walk faster without getting out of breath right away. I can carry my shopping bags without it immediately affecting my back and breathing. For example, I can play with my kids or my grandchildren without having to stop and take a break after just 3 minutes. And I've also clearly linked it to a faster recovery after any kind of strain. So you're back to normal quicker. All of that simply has an effect, which if you overdo it, even just a little bit, these effects already increase. And we're talking, as you've seen here, about It's not just about the training itself, but it's also very much about how we constantly discuss the great strength and importance of everyday movement, emphasizing that it must come to the forefront as an essential part of a healthy lifestyle. This too clearly already provides a significant upward boost.
Yes, I've also consistently observed this in my measurements from my past. Back in my Viva Meyer days, people who move a lot in their daily lives, who don't necessarily do that much sports, they still have values of perhaps 35. Then I observed a great many individuals from the Indian and Arab regions who naturally belong to the highest social strata, where prosperity is a clear indication that they allow themselves every conceivable comfort. There, a golf cart is always available to drive them around. No one ever takes the stairs anymore. So a personal trainer might come once a week who has them do a few hip rotations, but there's no real everyday movement. And suddenly you find young people with values of 2,100 or even less, truly in the high-risk category for cardiovascular disease. It's incredible what kind of adaptation is possible there. And let's really get those numbers clarified once more. You mentioned earlier that just moving from a low to a medium level would already be a truly fantastic effect, significantly reducing the risk. Exactly. What would that look like in practice, for example? Low, what would be the medium? Let's try to place ourselves there. Where do we want to go to get through our daily lives healthily?
Yes, well then, so
obviously, there are, of course, normal values somewhere. So what does low actually mean? Low, as I briefly mentioned just before, is anything that's around 20 milliliters. This is just a lower tier category. The risk of becoming dependent in your daily life increases, especially as you grow older. So this means that even simple tasks in your everyday routine will simply become more arduous. And that is quite unequivocally the absolute minimum. In principle, like it then depends a little bit on your age. It then goes up or down a little depending on the situation. But generally, as we said before, between the ages of 35 and 45, you're usually already at a good level, and that's where you can orient yourself. That's certainly a value you can definitely be happy with, where you might say, okay, depending on your age, where do I actually stand? Am I just average? Am I elite? Am I above average? Or am I below average? Is what's truly important. And I believe that as a health conscious individual, regardless of your age group, you should at least aim to be within this mid-range. So getting out of the lowest range must be the motto. That is, I think, the most crucial message one can convey. So if this value is measured and it's below that, then you really need to make sure you get out of that zone.
When it comes to performance, is there also an upward limit? Yes, generally it extends outwards.
At a sweet spot where you'd say, okay, doing a lot more training won't really provide much additional benefit. At some point, you'll also encounter the law of diminishing marginal returns.
Yes.
From a principle perspective, it's both a yes and a no. If you were to put that question to me, the amount of effort involved would simply be far too high. These are the key aspects.
Where does time efficiency dictate that the benefit of generating just 2 or 3 additional milliliters here is, from my perspective, and especially from a health standpoint, simply not essential? That makes no sense. What's truly needed is that beautiful middle ground. So just use a bit of common sense and ultimately to let that resonate. I believe that's also attractive for many because it then brings a certain lightness back into it and doesn't create this pressure. I absolutely must go full speed here because that's not always necessarily the right way.
Now, concerning this whole topic of healthy aging, longevity, there's a great deal of marketing, many myths, and countless products that are constantly emerging all around it. How do you assess this situation when you have VO₂max on your side and then this entire market of supplements, of treatments, all that's available? Where should one place their focus, in your opinion?
Well, I would perhaps break it down like this. Firstly, every small improvement truly counts. So as I had mentioned earlier, this prompt, that is these 3.5 milliliters, in principle already means a 13% reduction in overall mortality on average. a clear, unambiguous statement. And the connection is always dose dependent and very consistent. This means it's not about being fit or unfit, but rather one step at a time. And each step forward brings a clear benefit. That's point 2. This, of course, also points towards longevity. And of course, physical fitness, if you want to put it that way, is an absolutely powerful indicator and often proves to be stronger than many classic risk factors. And that's precisely why there are now quite a few studies and statements, even from the field of cardiology, that specifically emphasize this VO₂max marker, highlighting just how crucial it truly is. And that, I believe, is actually the most decisive point.
Sweet spot, because you mentioned earlier.
Perhaps one more thing on this, it's absolutely the limit. Naturally, there are still 2 aspects to this, which I gather from the data. In some studies, you see that the diminishing returns, the additional benefit of being too fit is significant, and after that, it flattens out even more. While in other studies, it indicates that additional benefits continue to be substantial. Obviously, there is no distinct upper limit. So there's definitely more room for progress. So I would say regarding health, most of what I mentioned earlier is now out of the risk zone and moving into the positive. And for sports, more can naturally always be quite beneficial, but there it's more about the pure performance level, and it's no longer about prevention or the health concept itself. So that must perhaps also be clearly filtered out, and that's why the difference might also be seen there regarding longevity and what are the most decisive factors.
Ways of accessing it.
Yes, then it's not so difficult, is it? If I had a strength training expert here, they would probably say that the muscle mass is the most important thing for healthy aging. If I had a flexibility expert, they would say, okay, we need to remain flexible, especially important in old age, maintaining coordination, flexibility, and keeping our joints healthy. And each of us is challenged to somehow integrate that into our daily routine. I have a job, I have a family, I might have a couple of hours during the week where I can get some exercise, where I have time. How would you classify this in terms of strength, endurance, agility?
As always, I'm a fan of a good balance, in both. So that's my basic principle. And those who are always one-sided only, and I'm exaggerating here, hitting the gym and just lifting weights will be at a disadvantage, just like those who only do endurance training and neglect everything else. Well, I believe the greatest gift you can give yourself is by finding a good mix here, perhaps also considering the time of year and slightly shifting your main focus, but otherwise remaining as versatile as possible. This is also something that has only recently become clearly evident, that the diversity of movement is in reality one of the greatest leverage mechanisms. And if such a leverage mechanism exists there, then it naturally also has a significant leverage effect with regard to V2max, and that must be stated unequivocally.
I am completely in agreement with you. We are absolutely on the very same wavelength.
I also believe that this is the right path in the long run. Anything else, however, won't lead to success or to lasting health if you're too one-sided in your approach. So clearly it requires this wonderful openness and plenty of physical activity.
Yes, that's what makes it so enjoyable, the sheer variety. I truly love having a lot of change. I tend to get bored quite quickly if I'm always doing the exact same thing. That's why I'm more than happy to pass this sentiment on. You touched upon the topic of age a little while ago. VO2max and age, those two are definitely connected. How does it develop if one doesn't do anything at all? And how does it develop if one does the right things?
Yes, well, it's quite clear. It's something to be expected. If one does absolutely nothing, your VO2max naturally decreases with advancing age. And obviously, complete inactivity accelerates this process, making it even more pronounced. What many people don't realize is that it's still partly biological and partly about your lifestyle. So what do I do? And that's exactly why movement, exercise, perhaps even as a supplement, especially in the middle age group, I believe is a truly powerful lever. So there you lay the foundation and essentially also the lever that determines how steeply the curve either goes downwards or remains stable, or in the ideal case, even at that age, marches upwards once again. Yes, and I find that quite attractive. as a prospect, actually. Yes, and ultimately, if you're already, for example, if you're already in your mid-20s, yes, and you have a really low value, what does that then mean for your future?
Well, one actually starts with very little in reserve, if you want to put it that way, right? So to begin at such a young age with hardly any kind of buffer, that's not exactly what you'd call very encouraging, indeed. This doesn't exclusively mean that you are somehow being labeled as sick or unwell, but simply that you are closer to the thresholds where everyday life can quickly become strenuous.
Yes, then you also have less of a buffer for all other things. If you have a stressful job, you might also encounter problems there, and then sleep may never happen. Who knows what happens during the family phase or whatever else. So these are all things that have an impact here, yes. And depending, of course, on which basis I'm starting from, I also have advantages and disadvantages here. Yes, if you don't change anything, if absolutely nothing happens here, then it's clearly the classic scenario. I'd probably find it easier to gain weight. Yes, my metabolism also becomes increasingly sluggish, and my range of motion clearly decreases even further as a result. And at some point, it's just going to become quite unpleasant, because we all understand, and the two of us are certainly experts on this, that if the human body isn't regularly moved, well, it tends to become quite dysfunctional because it was fundamentally designed to be in motion, you see. So if you deprive it of that, things will, in reality, only ever get worse, yeah.
I think you've really hit on a very important point there, which many people, I believe, aren't fully aware of. You've touched upon the topic of resilience. You didn't use that specific word, but this inherent resilience, this resistance that you possess when you're well-trained, when you're physically fit, when your VO₂max also reaches a certain level, then you can cope with everyday stresses much more easily. Whether it's in your professional life or within your family environment, you also recover much more quickly. Yes, it's also very strongly and directly connected to your fundamental endurance capability. And this connection, I believe, hasn't quite registered with many people yet, that through it, I'm actually strengthening my entire self in some way and can cope more easily with the daily stresses and demands of life.
Exactly. That is simply just...
How can we improve our VO₂max? We're talking so much about wanting to increase it. What should we do?
Well, it's something that's already been mentioned. Essentially, it means simply getting ultimately into motion. Yes, simply to make your daily life as efficient and active as possible. Yes. Well, these are, in principle, there are, of course, many, many different approaches. Yes, from my perspective, there are actually three key things that I find quite interesting. Firstly, I can certainly achieve this with short intervals, for example, and here I'm focusing purely on training or even the input itself. What physical actions can I take? Yes, I can do short intervals, like 4 times 4 minutes, for example. Yeah, where heart volume and the entire peripheral adaptation are quite strongly addressed and triggered. Yeah.
Let's explain this again for listeners who aren't from competitive sports. What does the 4x4 method mean?
Yeah, so just 4 minutes of really intense training and then an easy recovery period in between. And then again, 4 minutes hard, followed by another 4 minutes easy. Yes. And that's essentially this interval training where hard truly means hard. Yes. Not medium. Yes. And for many, especially in the health sector, it's often quite a challenge to mentally commit and truly give their absolute all. Yes. That is quite a challenge indeed, but and this is absolutely crucial. In addition to that, yes, the second important point is simply this relaxed training. Also, generally speaking, yes. So for me, this has always been that underestimated foundation. Yes, most people don't really like doing it because it's often a bit more boring. Yes, and that's why you don't like to do it. But there, I think that's like the connecting adhesive. Yeah, because there you get volume, there you get better circulation. Your mitochondria improve, your cells' powerhouses are well stimulated, regeneration is often even supported by it, yeah.
And we often find through our performance diagnostic measures that many train too often, what I'd call some moderately intense.
And somehow you can see that in the evaluations, it's almost like a stumbling block, yeah. That's why people don't improve, yeah. So that's also interesting. Often classic training from a training theory perspective makes methodological errors, yeah. or often lifting too much and not paying enough attention to the fundamentals, yes, or to the foundation. And the third thing that clearly belongs to this, and most people forget that it also has a significant impact even on your VO2 max, even if it's not immediately obvious, is simply our overall recovery, especially sleep, yes. Because we all know that adaptation, the most significant adaptation in restoration, happens during a period of rest. And the best break that we can grant ourselves physiologically is actually sleep, yes.
Because without pause.
This is a big appeal to all of you who, yes, also experience a lot of stress at work. Yes, you can't constantly be performing at such a high level. Your body absolutely needs its rest and recovery. We are simply not machines. Sooner or later, the man with the hammer is going to come. And it's much better if you recognize that early on. That's why it also makes sense to measure your VO2 max. Let's just quickly dive into that. You've often mentioned performance diagnostics. That's your field too. How can VO2 max be measured? And I think you also have a brand new method with you. Please briefly tell us a little about it.
Yes, well, fundamentally, it's certainly fair to say that the gold standard is spiroergometry, yes. So this is a graded exercise test, usually done on a bike, sometimes on a treadmill, where you wear a mask and your breathing gases are analyzed, right? The advantage is you get your VO2 max value, you get this kick value plus all the information, ventilation, threshold efficiency, you get all that. It's great for athletes, yeah. Well, it's also quite helpful for extreme cases and for prevention, yes. But it's quite elaborate and very few people do it. And accordingly, they don't take on the financial expenses, yes.
How much does such a performance diagnostic cost? What can you expect from it?
That depends on the provider, obviously. So if you look around, I believe you'll find everything from 200 euros up to 500 euros. Yeah. So it's quite an investment.
So it's quite an investment where you really consider, okay, what's the benefit for me? But what exactly would it bring to a health conscious person, someone not focused on competitive sports? What would be the advantage for them if they were to undergo a VO2 max measurement, a spiroergometry?
From my perspective, it's actually a waste of money. I'm really quite clear on that.
Very honest
I would
answer.
really, yeah, absolutely, yes. So if I were to be approached about it, and then I would inquire about what the actual goal is of the client or the athlete or whoever it may be, the interested party at that moment, yes, then I am usually, I would say 90% of the time, more inclined to give him that. I wouldn't want to call it an excuse. No, that would be incorrect. Yes. But I'd say that's something you can invest your time in much better elsewhere. Yeah. Because whether someone knows precisely how the ventilation operates within specific threshold ranges is, from my point of view, for someone who's genuinely interested in their health, quite simply irrelevant. Yes. What's much more important to me is that he knows in which heart rate zones his training should be structured later, so he trains efficiently and reaches his goal. To me, the VO2 max is almost actually unimportant, yes. So I'm just saying that from this diagnostics angle, more from the health sector. When we have athletes, that's naturally a different matter, yes. That's why we need to make a distinction here. And for the most part, I would say you're perfectly fine with the classic performance diagnostic without spiroergometry if you analyze it properly and can then derive sensible training recommendations from it, because that's actually what gets implemented in practice, right? Because nobody measures again later.
And that is in reality then just unnecessary, you know. But that's why that's my opinion on that, you know. There are, of course, also...
But now you've also brought us something new. That's not so complex, and we won't have to do anymore.
Yes, I'll save that particular point for the very end, but I still find it quite fascinating because most people, if you just take a look around the world these days, we all tend to wear some form of smartwatch, don't we? And quite frequently now, the question often arises, well, I already possess a watch or some other similar device on me that also measures these things as well, doesn't it?
And I would have to say that is fundamentally correct, yes.
But yes, there is, of course, a but here. Yes, it's like this. Firstly, these different watches and wearables, yes, also have different algorithms, and sometimes very big differences can arise here. You also can't compare them with each other. Almost everywhere you get a different result. So that confuses and misleads many people, yes. But as a trend tool, yes, I still find it fundamentally quite exciting for the healthcare sector and also perfectly fine, yes.
But not as a diagnosis, no, but rather as a guide or an indicator. If I track this over a longer period of time and measure it consistently at similar times, that's also absolutely crucial, yes. Then I can at least derive a trend here to see in which direction things are moving. But as a diagnosis, in my opinion, it is not suitable, no. So that is definitely not its purpose.
Yes, and finally, since you've already brought that up twice, yes, there is a truly significant innovation, specifically the fact that one can measure this value without any exertion while at rest, and that's in not even, under 3 minutes. How does that work exactly?
And now it's getting really exciting, yes. There are actually technologies that can determine VO₂max from the mechanics of the heartbeat. And one of the innovations currently on the market was developed by a Danish entrepreneur with a Danish university.
This operates using what is commonly known as a seismograph. Yes, this is actually what we refer to as seismocardiography. Yes, to put it in very simple terms, what that means is a small, highly sensitive, I actually even have it right here with me. I simply couldn't resist bringing it along, so I'll just place it right here. Yes, so this is what the thing looks like. So it's completely unspectacular, yes, and very small, as you can see, yes.
Awesome.
Well, with this small, highly sensitive sensor, it measures very, very subtle movements. You could almost say these are vibrations of the chest, which are caused by the heartbeat. And then through a special algorithm, a so-called VO₂max estimate or a specific value is derived from that, you see. And that's great. And the truly wonderful thing about it is it's not some kind of magic or anything like that. No, but it's actually based on, yes, very clear correlations within cardiac mechanics regarding stroke volume, regarding the timing, and so on. And there are now, by the way, some truly excellent scientific studies available, that have also thoroughly validated this particular work, and therefore this approach is genuinely applicable and highly practical for real-world use in clinical practice, possessing a very high and serious scientific standing indeed. Of course, spirometry will always remain the undisputed gold standard, yes. But this new method measured at rest, I think, is a game changer when it comes to fitness. It's the basic assessment of VO₂max, moving towards a broad checkup, especially in companies where we often use it to measure JAR because it's uncomplicated and is a totally low threshold approach, JAR, because you know yourself, right? So if someone says, okay, you can all do a spirometry and then you'll be wearing a mask, well, many will say, oh my God, I'm absolutely not putting on that mask. No way. Why? Because of maximum exertion.
Capacity.
Exactly, and so on. And I find that to be very exciting. And we are now, as the very first company, to offer this particular service within the BGF setting. And we have truly already gained some wonderful experiences.
And what we also do is not just take one measurement, but as part of our service, we also offer taking a second measurement after a few months, simply to track this progression, or in this case, the improvement. And that is...
The move days would then be perfect for that. At the beginning of the move days, even though we are already a little way into this, it's still possible to take a measurement and then to train, to really get moving, perhaps to step out of your comfort zone for once, to try some interval training, and then to measure again after a few months to see if your VO₂max has improved. That, as you've mentioned, even small improvements, especially in the lower range, can have an enormously significant impact and move us out of this risk zone. Yes, that's a great thing. Thank you for introducing us to this innovation. And of course, anyone who wants to know more can contact Hans directly. Hans, our partner for HRV and VO₂max measurements. And yes, he'd gladly come to your company to check your employees and you, of course. All right, my dear Hans, let me just briefly summarize. We've already moved quite far along. Time, as it always does, just flies by. What exactly do we have today? What are the main things we can take away? What can you then also take for yourself and for your daily training and exercise routine? So, VO₂max as a truly, truly vital parameter for assessing our overall health. Yes, certainly not the only one, but the central one, and now also scientifically proven to very strongly influence the risk of mortality and the risk of cardiovascular diseases, making it arguably the most important parameter of all. And even small steps, as we have already emphasized several times today, can achieve a great effect. Yes, right. Let's put it in numbers again. 3.5 milliliters, as you mentioned, one met a 13% reduction in risk. So that's an absolutely incredible connection. And these 3.5 milliliters, that's something you can certainly achieve, even within a period of 3, 4, 5, or 6 months through consistent training. Yes, exactly. That's really not an unrealistic goal at all. Yes, what else did we have then? Yes, of course, also the topic of measurements. How can one measure what we discussed towards the end? Spiroergometry, yes, for the ambitious athlete, for competitive sports, it is still very much a standard. Even ambitious amateur athletes can still, get special tips and tricks and really get the hang of it for the right training area. But for the general health sector, what you've just presented is probably the most uncomplicated low-effort measurement method. Here directly on the chest in just a few minutes, without any strenuous exertion, without any physical strain, even while at complete rest, then it's very, very effective and goal-oriented. So your VO₂max should definitely be kept in mind. If your health is important to you, then you should know your VO₂max value and also be able to recognize the trends. It can have a very, very, very significant and positive impact on your life and your long and healthy life. Hans, the final words are yours. What else would you like to add? What message would you like to share with all our Move Days participants and our podcast listeners?
Fundamentally, I'm a big fan of your Move Days. That's clear. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. This is a truly great movement that's being set in motion here, and you are truly very successful. I congratulate you every time. That's great. This is something you can support and bring as many people as possible into the movement so that they simply pay a little more attention to their health, and together, of course, it's often much easier. To conclude, perhaps just one more example, because I find that's always what's easiest to truly grasp and understand. Just recently, actually, coming out of a VO₂max test, I just recently tested a relatively young employee. He's relatively slim, plays soccer once a week and actually feels quite athletic, So subjectively, from his own perspective, he's top notch, And he actually paused in his VO₂max pause, I believe. He had 29 milliliters, yes. So for his age, that's significantly below average, yes. And he was very surprised, yes, at pause, because he said, but I'm already quite athletic, yes. Well, yes, his body showed that he had relatively little in reserve. So that's basically the outcome of this particular measurement. And we actually altered two things as a direct result. Yes, we prescribed him a short, structured interval training session each week, and also, as I mentioned earlier, a light endurance workout. And the cool thing is now, and here's the absolute kicker of the whole story, we did exactly that for a full 8 weeks, and after those 8 weeks, we measured him again, and he had gained an additional 6 milliliters. So, from 29 to 35 in 8 weeks. Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what I mentioned at the beginning. And that should perhaps be a reminder for everyone, once again, that when you're relatively low, with a bit of structure and consistency, you can gain a lot of ground in a short time. What are 2 months, really? It's nothing. This means that if you consistently stay committed to this, the likelihood of you continuing to build upon your progress and developing further here is simply very, very substantial. And I remember distinctly, he found it to be extremely cool. He mentioned that he recovers much more quickly when he plays soccer these days. And also, he said he feels significantly less tired at his job. So I think this is an excellent example with which one can somehow conclude and perhaps also touch upon the general motivation. It's not even primarily about the VO₂max value itself, but rather to fundamentally demonstrate once more that if you just incorporate a little something, perhaps structured and continuously as a routine into your lifestyle, then your VO₂max value can automatically be brought up as well.
And that is really quite simple and easy to understand.
Yes, thank you for this very illustrative example to wrap things up. I believe that really brings the point home. Once again, VO₂max is not something that is exclusively for athletes, but it is truly also a matter of life quality. That's exactly how you described it. Thank you so much, dear Hans, for being with us. And many thanks to all of you who joined us again today. And yes, let's keep giving our all for the Move Days. We still have several weeks ahead of us. We have a lot more to do. Let's make a bigger impact together. Use it or lose it.
Move more together for you, your team, and a good cause. Join the Movivo Move Days, the ultimate health challenge during Lent, and win exclusive prizes. Collect points for 45 days in the Movivo app, together with your colleagues or in your own personal way. Whether it's through your favorite sports, breathing exercises, giving up sugar, or ice bathing, every point counts. Are you ready?